Unaware his poor wife inherited the royal treasury, he mocked her until the Alpha King Dad showed up. The autumn wind swept through the narrow streets of Boston, carrying with it the scent of the harbor and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Margaret stood at the wooden counter of the apothecary shop, her hands trembling as she counted the meager coins her husband had left her that morning. 3 shillings. It would barely be enough for bread and firewood, let alone the herbs she needed for the tincture that kept old Mrs. Henderson's fever at bay. "Margaret, dear, are you quite well?" The apothecary, a kind man named Thomas Green, peered at her over his spectacles with genuine concern etched across his weathered face. She forced a smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. "Yes, Mr. Green. Just deciding what I can afford today." Her stomach churned with familiar shame as she pushed 2 shillings across the counter. "Just the willow bark, please." The year was 1485, and Boston streets teemed with merchants, laborers, and nobles alike, each playing their part in the great tapestry of medieval life. Margaret had once believed she would find her place among them when she married Richard Ashford 3 years prior. He had seemed so different then, attentive, gentle, promising her a life of modest comfort. But the man who returned to their small cottage each evening bore little resemblance to the suitor who had courted her. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Margaret stepped out into the cobblestone street, clutching her small package close to her chest. The buildings loomed tall on either side, their timber frames dark against the gray sky. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out the hour, their solemn tones echoing across the rooftops. She pulled her worn cloak tighter, feeling the bite of the October air seep through the thin wool. "Well, if it isn't my dear wife, spending what little I earn." Richard's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. He stood in the doorway of the tavern, his face already flushed from ale despite the early hour. 2 of his companions snickered behind him, men she recognized from the docks where Richard worked, when he chose to work. "I was buying medicine for Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said quietly, keeping her eyes lowered. She had learned that meeting his gaze only fueled his anger. "Medicine!" Richard strode forward, his boots heavy on the stones. "And who will pay for our supper? Your precious sick neighbor?" He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through the fabric. "You're worthless, Margaret. Your father was a penniless clerk, God rest his miserable soul. And you're no better. I should have married the baker's daughter when I had the chance." The crowd on the street parted around them, some averting their eyes, others watching with the morbid fascination reserved for public spectacles. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I'll make it stretch." "You'd better." Richard released her with a shove that nearly sent her sprawling. "I'll be home at sunset, and there'd better be a proper meal waiting." He turned back to the tavern, his laughter mixing with that of his friends as they disappeared through the doorway. Margaret stood alone in the street, her arm throbbing where he'd gripped her, her heart heavy with a weight she couldn't name. She had no way of knowing that in a fortnight, everything would change. She had no way of knowing that the letter she would receive, sealed with red wax and bearing a crest she'd never seen, would shatter every certainty in her small, painful world. But for now, she simply walked home through the winding streets of Boston, past the butcher's shop and the blacksmith's forge, past the grand houses of merchants and the humble dwellings of laborers, until she reached the cottage she shared with Richard. It was a small structure, its thatched roof badly in need of repair, its single room divided by a curtain that offered the illusion of privacy. She set about preparing their evening meal with mechanical efficiency, her mind far away. Margaret remembered her father with sudden clarity. His gentle hands, his patience as he taught her to read, despite Richard's later mockery of such useless accomplishments. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her nothing but debts and memories. Or so she had thought. The fire crackled in the small hearth, and Margaret stirred the thin pottage, adding the vegetables she'd managed to purchase at market earlier in the week. The light outside faded to purple, then indigo, and still Richard did not return. She waited, as she always did, the food growing cold, her stomach empty, her heart emptying further with each passing hour. When Richard finally stumbled through the door well after dark, reeking of ale and something else, perfume perhaps, Margaret said nothing. She reheated the pottage while he collapsed onto their straw mattress, already half asleep. She ate alone in the darkness, listening to his snores, wondering how her life had become so small, so suffocating, so entirely without hope. The following days, blurred together in a haze of sameness. Richard's cruelty had become as predictable as the changing of the seasons. He would drink, he would mock, he would take what little money she earned from her needlework and spend it on ale and dice games. Margaret had learned to make herself invisible, to move through their cottage like a ghost, to speak only when spoken to, and even then, to keep her words few and soft. On the morning of October 15th, Margaret was at the well in the town square when she noticed the stranger. He was mounted on a magnificent black horse, his clothing finer than anything she'd seen outside the manor houses. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold a fierce intelligence. 2 other riders flanked him, equally well dressed, their bearing suggesting military training. The stranger dismounted near the church, speaking in low tones to the priest. Margaret noticed other women whispering, speculating about who these men might be. Visiting nobility, perhaps, or royal messengers. Such visits were rare in Boston, a town that served primarily as a port for merchants and fishermen. She thought nothing more of it until that afternoon when a knock came at her door. Margaret opened it to find a young man in livery, holding a sealed letter. "Margaret Ashford, formerly Margaret Thornton?" he asked, his voice formal. "Yes," she managed, her throat suddenly dry. "This is for you, my lady, from the royal court." He pressed the letter into her hands and departed before she could form a question. Margaret stared at the letter, her fingers tracing the red wax seal. The crest pressed into it showed a lion and a crown. Symbols she couldn't place, but that radiated authority. Her hands shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The words swam before her eyes at first, and she had to read them 3 times before their meaning penetrated her disbelief. To Margaret Thornton Ashford, daughter of William Thornton. Greetings. It is our duty to inform you that your late father, William Thornton, was in fact Lord William Thornton, 3rd son of the Duke of Lancaster, who renounced his title and inheritance to marry your mother, a commoner. Upon his death and the recent deaths of his 2 elder brothers without male heirs, certain properties, titles, and treasury holdings have reverted to his line. As his sole surviving child and heir, you are summoned to London to claim your inheritance, including the estate of Thornton Manor, its lands, and the sum of 12,000 gold sovereigns currently held in the royal treasury. A representative of the Crown will call upon you within the fortnight to arrange your journey. The letter fell from her nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. 12,000 gold sovereigns. The sum was beyond imagining, more money than she could conceive of spending in 10 lifetimes. And a manor, lands, a title. Her father, her gentle, bookish father who had worked as a clerk, who had died in debt, had been nobility. He had never spoken of it, had never given any indication of his past life. Perhaps he had wanted to protect her, or perhaps he had simply left that world behind so completely that it ceased to exist for him. Margaret sat down heavily on the wooden stool, her mind reeling. She thought of Richard, of his constant mockery of her poverty, his sneering references to her worthless father. She thought of the hunger, the cold, the endless humiliation. And now, impossibly, everything had changed. But the joy that should have accompanied such news was tempered by fear. Richard would know soon enough. The messenger had made no effort at discretion, and in a town the size of Boston, news traveled faster than fire. How would Richard react? Would he see her differently, or would he simply find new ways to torment her? New reasons to claim ownership over her suddenly valuable person? The door slammed open, and Richard stood there, his face mottled with rage and something else. Was it fear? "What's this I hear about a letter from the royal court?" he demanded, advancing on her. "Where is it?" Margaret pointed mutely to the floor. Richard snatched up the letter, his lips moving as he struggled through the formal language. She watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to calculation. When he finally looked at her, his eyes held a gleam she'd never seen before. 12,000 sovereigns, he breathed, and a manor. By God, Margaret, you're an heiress. He laughed, a harsh, manic sound. And you're my wife, which means it's all mine. Margaret felt ice flood her veins. Of course, under the law, a wife's property belonged to her husband. Everything she had just inherited, every coin, every acre of land, would become Richard's the moment she claimed it. She would go from poverty to wealth, but her prison would remain the same, merely gilded now instead of gray. "We're going to London," Richard announced, already pacing, his mind clearly racing ahead. "We'll claim your inheritance, sell the manor, and move somewhere grand. Perhaps we'll buy a house in London itself. I'll never have to work another day." He stopped, grabbing her shoulders, his grip painful. "This changes everything, Margaret. Everything." She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Yes, she thought bitterly. Everything and nothing. That evening, Richard was almost kind to her, his excitement overriding his usual cruelty. He spoke of the life they would lead, the fine clothes they would wear, the respect they would command. Margaret listened and said little, her mind turning over possibilities like stones in a river. There had to be a way. There had to be something in the law, some protection, some recourse. But what? And who would help her? The stranger from that morning came to mind, the man on the black horse with his fine clothes and commanding presence. He had been speaking to the priest. Perhaps he was connected to the royal court. Perhaps he was even the representative mentioned in the letter. The next morning, while Richard slept off another night of celebratory drinking, Margaret slipped out of the cottage and made her way to the church. Father Benedict was an old man, kind but cautious, who had known her father. If anyone might have answers, it would be him. She found him in the small garden behind the church, tending to the herbs used for medicines and ceremonies. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creasing into a smile that faded when he saw her expression. "Child, what troubles you?" he asked, setting down his pruning shears. Margaret glanced around to ensure they were alone, then told him everything. About the letter, about Richard's reaction, about her fear that she would simply trade one form of bondage for another. Father Benedict listened in silence, his expression growing grave. "The law is indeed as you fear," he said slowly. "A husband has rights over his wife's property. However," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "there are exceptions. The crown can place property in trust beyond the reach of a husband if there is sufficient cause. And the representative who came to see me yesterday, Lord Edmund Blackwood, indicated that your case is of particular interest to the crown." "Why?" Margaret asked, her heart beginning to race. Why would the crown care about one woman's inheritance? Father Benedict's expression grew even more serious. "Because, my child, your inheritance includes more than property and gold. Your grandfather, the Duke of Lancaster, served the previous king with distinction. There are matters of loyalty, of old alliances, that extend beyond simple wealth. Lord Blackwood suggested that your father may have left something else. Documents, perhaps, or information. that the crown wishes to secure. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. What sort of information? That, he did not say. But he asked many questions about your father, about his character, his loyalties, whether he had spoken of his past. Father Benedict reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Margaret, you must be careful. The game you've entered is larger than you know, but there may be hope in that very fact. If the crown has interest in your inheritance beyond its monetary value, they may be willing to protect it, and you, from your husband's claims. How? Margaret whispered. Lord Blackwood will return tomorrow. Speak with him honestly. Tell him of your situation. He struck me as a man of honor, and he has the king's authority. If anyone can help you, it would be him. Margaret left the church with her mind spinning, hope and fear warring within her. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely hearing Richard's endless planning and boasting. That night, she lay awake long after he had fallen asleep, staring at the darkness and trying to imagine a future that held something other than despair. Lord Edmund Blackwood arrived at noon the following day, and this time Richard was present. Margaret watched her husband transform, his usual swagger giving way to an obsequious deference that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. Richard bowed repeatedly, offering their humble home for the Lord's use, promising cooperation, speaking as though he and Margaret were equals in this sudden fortune. Lord Blackwood's gaze moved between them with an assessment that missed nothing. He was younger than Margaret had initially thought, perhaps 30, with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. When those eyes settled on Margaret, she felt exposed, but not threatened. There was intelligence there, and something else, understanding. Mrs. Ashford, Lord Blackwood said, his voice cultured but not cold. I wonder if I might speak with you privately about your father's effects. There are some questions regarding his papers that only you might answer. Richard began to object. Anything regarding my wife's inheritance is my concern as well. But Lord Blackwood silenced him with a look. This concerns matters of the crown, he said quietly, and the steel beneath his courtesy became suddenly apparent. You will wait here. Margaret followed Lord Blackwood outside, her heart pounding. He led her a short distance from the cottage, to where they could speak without being overheard, but where they remained visible to anyone who might look out. Propriety, even in urgency, had to be maintained. Mrs. Ashford, he began, and his voice had lost its formal edge, becoming almost gentle. Father Benedict spoke to me of your concerns. I want you to understand something clearly. The Crown's interest in your inheritance extends beyond the Treasury and lands. Your father possessed information, records of old loyalties and debts from the war between Lancaster and York. With the recent ascension of King Henry VII, these records have become valuable evidence of who supported which side, who can be trusted in the new regime. Margaret struggled to process this. My father kept such records? Hidden within his personal papers, yes. We believe he did so to protect certain individuals, including himself. Now those records need to be secured and their contents evaluated. Lord Blackwood paused, his expression softening. But I can see that you have more immediate concerns. Your husband, I have made inquiries. His reputation is not favorable. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame mixing with a sudden, fierce anger. He will take everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The law gives him that right. The law is complex, Lord Blackwood replied, and the Crown has certain prerogatives. If I were to recommend that your inheritance be placed in royal trust, administered by Crown-appointed trustees with you as the beneficiary, your husband would have no legal claim to it. The precedent exists for cases where Crown interests are involved. Hope blazed so bright in Margaret's chest that it hurt. You would do that? You can do that. I can recommend it, and given the circumstances, I believe King Henry will approve. However, He hesitated, and Margaret felt her hope waver. However, you would need to travel to London to formally claim the inheritance, and to provide testimony regarding your father's papers. Your husband could accompany you, but he would need to be made to understand that his behavior is under royal scrutiny. He won't change, Margaret said flatly. Not truly. He'll pretend for a time, but then we shall ensure that the legal protections are ironclad, Lord Blackwood said firmly. I cannot undo your marriage, Mrs. Ashford, but I can ensure that your inheritance, and thus your independence, remains yours. You will have means, resources, the ability to make your own choices about your life. Tears stung Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them back. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. Lord Blackwood's expression grew distant for a moment. I knew your father briefly, many years ago. He was kind to a young squire who had lost his way during the wars. I never forgot that kindness. When I learned that William Thornton's daughter had married a man of Richard Ashford's character, he shook his head. Let us say I believe in paying old debts. Your father helped me when I needed it. Now I can help his daughter. Margaret felt something shift inside her, some locked door beginning to open. When do we leave for London? 3 days hence. I'll arrange for proper traveling provisions and guards. We'll make the journey in stages, stopping at royal way stations. It will take perhaps a fortnight to reach the capital, weather permitting. Lord Blackwood's expression became stern. Your husband will need to be controlled during the journey. If he creates difficulties, I have the authority to have him restrained. Make sure he understands that. Margaret nodded, though the thought of conveying such a message to Richard filled her with dread. Still, with Lord Blackwood's authority behind her, perhaps Richard would listen. Perhaps for once, he would be forced to show restraint. That evening, Margaret told Richard about the journey to London and Lord Blackwood's stipulations. As expected, Richard's reaction was explosive. Rage, accusations, threats. But when Margaret quietly mentioned that Lord Blackwood had the king's authority to have Richard arrested if he proved difficult, her husband fell silent. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of immediate anger against future gain. Fine, he finally spat. I'll play the dutiful husband for his lordship. But once we have the money, Margaret, remember who truly owns it. Remember who you belong to. Margaret said nothing, but for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she didn't belong to anyone but herself. The 3 days before their departure passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret had few possessions worth bringing, but Lord Blackwood's servants arrived with chests of appropriate clothing for a lady of her new station. Fine wool dresses, proper cloaks, even jewelry that made Richard's eyes gleam with greed. She felt like an impostor wearing such finery, but Lord Blackwood assured her it was necessary. You are claiming a title and an estate, he explained. You must look the part, or you'll face challenges to your claim. On the morning of their departure, Margaret stood in the town square as dawn broke over Boston. 4 wagons waited, along with a dozen armed guards, their presence turning heads and sparking whispers throughout the gathered crowd. Richard stood beside her, dressed in new clothes that transformed him from a dock worker into something resembling a gentleman, though his surly expression undermined the effect. Lord Blackwood approached, mounted on his black horse, looking every inch the royal representative. Are you ready, Mrs. Ashford? Margaret took a deep breath of the cold October air and looked around at the town that had been her prison for so long. Then she climbed into the carriage that waited for her, settling onto cushions softer than any bed she'd ever known, and nodded. I'm ready. The journey to London began. The roads were rough, churned into mud by autumn rains, but the carriage was well sprung, and Margaret found the discomfort bearable, compared to the growing sense of possibility that filled her with each mile they traveled. Richard rode in a separate wagon with some of the guards, kept apart from her by Lord Blackwood's careful arrangements. She saw him watching her through the wagon's opening, his expression unreadable. They stopped the first night at a royal way station, a fortified inn that served crown messengers and officials. Margaret was given a private room, the first time in years she'd slept alone, and she lay in the narrow bed feeling both liberated and terrified. What was she doing? Who was she becoming? The questions circled through her mind like restless birds. A knock came at her door near midnight. Margaret tensed, thinking it might be Richard. But Lord Blackwood's voice called softly, "Mrs. Ashford? I thought you might have questions. May I speak with you briefly? The door can remain open for propriety." Margaret wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the door. Lord Blackwood stood in the corridor, still fully dressed, holding a leather satchel. "I've brought your father's papers," he said. "I thought you might wish to see them, to understand what he left you beyond gold and property." They sat in the small room with the door ajar, the corridor lamp providing enough light to read by. Lord Blackwood spread the papers across the narrow table. Letters, lists, what appeared to be coded messages. Margaret recognized her father's handwriting, but much of the content made little sense to her. "These are records of who supported Lancaster during the Wars of the Roses," Lord Blackwood explained, pointing to various entries. Names, dates, amounts of money or troops contributed. Your father served as a kind of secret chancellor, keeping track of loyalties when such information meant life or death. When the wars ended, he took these records and disappeared, presumably to protect those named here. Now, with King Henry on the throne, a Lancaster claimant, these records prove who can be trusted. Margaret touched the pages, feeling the weight of her father's secrets. "He never told me any of this." "He was protecting you," Lord Blackwood said gently. "If the wrong people had known what he possessed, you would have been in danger. Even now, there are factions who would prefer these records destroyed or altered." He met her eyes. "That's another reason why your inheritance must be protected. There are those who might try to use your husband against you, to gain control of these papers through him." "All the more reason to keep it from Richard's hands," Margaret said, feeling a fierce protectiveness for her father's legacy. "Indeed." Lord Blackwood began gathering the papers. "In London, you'll meet with the Lord Chancellor and provide formal testimony about these documents. It's largely a formality. I've already briefed the King's advisors, but it establishes your value to the crown beyond your inheritance. It makes you, in essence, untouchable by common legal challenges." After Lord Blackwood left, Margaret sat alone with her thoughts. Her father had been a man of secrets, a protector of others at great personal cost. He had given up his title, his wealth, his entire life to keep dangerous information safe and to protect those he'd served with, and he'd raised her in poverty, rather than risk exposing her to the dangers that wealth might bring. She thought she finally understood him, and the understanding brought both grief and pride. The next day's journey was longer, taking them deeper into the English countryside. The landscape shifted from coastal towns to rolling farmland, the autumn colors painting the hills in shades of gold and russet. Margaret watched through the carriage window, marveling at how vast the world seemed beyond the narrow streets of Boston. They passed through villages and hamlets, each one a small world unto itself. Margaret saw women drawing water from wells, children chasing chickens through muddy yards, men working in fields to bring in the last of the harvest. Normal lives, ordinary struggles. She had thought her own life was small, but seeing these glimpses of others reminded her that everyone carried their own burdens, their own hidden stories. On the third day, Richard forced a confrontation. During a stop to rest the horses, he cornered Margaret near the edge of the travelers' camp, his face twisted with suppressed rage. "You think you're better than me now?" he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that the guards wouldn't hear. "Riding in a fine carriage, wearing silk, speaking with lords. But you're still my wife, Margaret, still bound to me by God's law and man's. And when this is over, when we have the money, we'll see how high and mighty you are." Margaret met his gaze steadily, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "The inheritance will be held in Crown Trust," she said quietly. "Lord Blackwood has already arranged it. You'll have no legal claim to any of it." Richard's hand shot out, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You think some piece of paper will stop me? You're my wife. Mine. I'll find a way. Is there a problem here?" Lord Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a blade. He stood a few feet away, his hand resting casually on the sword at his hip. Behind him, 2 guards had materialized, their expressions neutral but ready. Richard released Margaret's arm immediately, his face flushing. "No problem, my lord. Just a private conversation between husband and wife." "I see." Lord Blackwood's tone suggested he saw quite clearly indeed. "Mr. Ashford, a word of advice. The king takes a dim view of men who mistreat those under royal protection, and Mrs. Ashford is very much under royal protection now. Do I make myself clear?" The threat was unmistakable. Richard nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscles jumping. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed fury. Lord Blackwood approached Margaret, his expression concerned. "Are you hurt?" "Just bruises," Margaret said, rubbing her arm. "Nothing new." The sadness that crossed Lord Blackwood's face was brief, but genuine. "It will end," he said softly. "I promise you that. One way or another, this will end." They reached London on the 10th day of travel, and Margaret's first glimpse of the capital stole her breath. The city sprawled across the landscape like some enormous living creature, its buildings pressed close together, its streets teeming with more people than Margaret had seen in her entire life combined. The Thames River cut through it all, crowded with boats and ships, its bridges thick with traffic. Lord Blackwood rode alongside her carriage, pointing out landmarks, the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, the still unfinished royal palace. "You'll be staying at a crown residence near the palace," he explained. "It's modest but secure. Your formal audience with the Lord Chancellor is scheduled for 3 days hence, which gives you time to rest and prepare." The residence was anything but modest by Margaret's standards. A stone building with multiple rooms, fine furniture, and servants who bowed when she entered. Richard was housed in separate quarters nearby, a careful arrangement that kept them apart while maintaining the appearance of propriety. That first night in London, Margaret stood at the window of her room, looking out over the city's lights. Somewhere out there, in this vast, sprawling capital, her future waited to be claimed. But what future? She was still married to Richard, still bound by law and custom. The inheritance would be protected, yes, but she would never truly be free. Unless something changed. Unless the king's protection extended beyond her property to her person. Unless the law could be bent or broken or rewritten. A servant knocked and entered with a message. "Mrs. Ashford, Lord Blackwood requests your presence in the study. He says there's someone you need to meet." Margaret followed the servant through the house's corridors, her heart beginning to race with an anxiety she couldn't name. The study was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth, and Lord Blackwood stood beside an older man, perhaps 50, who turned as she entered. The stranger was tall, with silver threading through his dark hair, and his face held a stern nobility that commanded attention. He wore rich clothing, but no obvious symbols of rank, and when his eyes met Margaret's, she felt a jolt of recognition that made no sense. She'd never seen this man before in her life, yet something about his bearing, his features, struck a chord of familiarity. "Mrs. Ashford?" Lord Blackwood said, his voice careful. "May I present Lord Thomas Thornton, Duke of Lancaster?" The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the back of a chair for support. "Duke of Lancaster? But my father, his brothers." "I am not descended from those brothers," the Duke said, his voice deep and measured. "I am your father's elder half-brother, from your grandfather's first marriage. Your father and I were raised separately after our father's first wife died. We met only once, briefly, when we were young men." He paused, and something shifted in his stern expression, a crack showing grief beneath. "I didn't learn of his death until recently, when Lord Blackwood began investigating your inheritance. William and we had lost touch. I've regretted that for many years." Margaret's mind struggled to process this. "You're my uncle?" "Yes." The Duke stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "And you have his look about you, his eyes, his determined chin. I see my brother in you, child." "But why—" Margaret's voice broke. She tried again. "Why are you here?" The Duke's expression grew even more serious. "Because I've learned of your situation, your inheritance, your marriage, the dangers you face. Lord Blackwood has briefed me thoroughly." He paused, then spoke with careful deliberation. "I've come to offer you an alternative." Margaret waited, afraid to hope, afraid to speak. "The marriage can be annulled," the Duke said quietly, "on grounds of coercion and fraud. Lord Blackwood has gathered testimony suggesting your husband misrepresented his character and circumstances when he courted you, and that your father, had he lived and known the truth, would never have consented to the match. It's a thin argument legally, but with royal backing and my support, it can be made to stand." "Annulled?" Margaret whispered. The word seemed too large, too impossible. "I could be free?" "You could be free," the Duke confirmed, "but you must understand the cost. Such an annulment would be controversial. Your husband will contest it. There will be hearings, testimony, public scrutiny. Your life will be examined in detail, and not all of it will be pleasant. Society will judge you, some harshly. And even if we succeed, you'll be a woman alone, unmarried in a world that doesn't know quite what to do with such creatures." "But she won't be alone," Lord Blackwood interjected. "She'll have family, you, your Grace, and she'll have her inheritance, her title. She'll have means and independence." Margaret looked between the two men, her uncle and her unexpected champion, and felt tears finally spill over. "I'll endure the scrutiny," she said, her voice shaking but certain. "I'll face whatever judgment comes. Anything is better than remaining bound to Richard Ashford." The Duke nodded slowly, approval showing in his eyes. "Then we'll proceed. But first, you need to formally claim your inheritance tomorrow. Once that's secured, we'll begin the annulment process." That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in the darkness, her mind racing through all that had happened, all that might yet come. Freedom seemed impossibly close now, separated from her by only a few legal procedures, and the courage to face public examination of her failed marriage. But hadn't she already survived worse? Hadn't she already endured years of cruelty in private? At least this scrutiny would lead somewhere, would end with liberation instead of simply continuing endlessly. The morning of her audience with the Lord Chancellor dawned cold and clear. Margaret dressed in the finest gown Lord Blackwood's servants had provided, deep blue wool with silver embroidery, her hair dressed properly with a small circlet that marked her rank. She barely recognized herself in the polished mirror, this woman who looked like nobility, despite feeling like an imposter. Richard had been informed of the meeting and arrived in the antechamber, with barely suppressed rage radiating from him. He tried to approach Margaret, but Lord Blackwood and 2 guards blocked his path. "You'll observe from a distance," Lord Blackwood said calmly. "Those are the Lord Chancellor's orders." The audience chamber was magnificent, all carved wood and tapestries depicting historical scenes. The Lord Chancellor himself was an elderly man with sharp eyes, flanked by scribes and witnesses. Margaret stood before him, her uncle beside her, and recited the oath required to formally claim her inheritance. Her voice shook only slightly as she spoke the words that transferred her father's property, titles, and treasury holdings into her name, held in trust by Crown appointees, protected from any claim by her husband. When it was done, the Lord Chancellor looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "You understand, Mrs. Ashford, that this arrangement is highly unusual. Your husband's legal claims have been superseded by Crown interest in your father's legacy. However, this doesn't dissolve your marriage. For that." He glanced at the Duke. "Other measures must be taken." "I understand, Your Grace," Margaret said steadily, "and I'm prepared for whatever comes next." The Lord Chancellor nodded. "Very well. The Crown recognizes Margaret Thornton Ashford as rightful heir to the Thornton estate and Treasury. Let it be recorded." Richard's roar of fury echoed through the chamber. "This is theft. She's my wife. Her property is mine by right." He tried to push forward, but the guards restrained him. "You can't do this. I'll appeal to the king himself." "The king," said a new voice from the doorway, "is already well informed." Everyone turned. A man in royal livery stood there, his expression grave. "His Majesty has reviewed this case personally. The ruling stands. Furthermore, annulment proceedings have been authorized to begin immediately, on grounds of marital fraud and coercion." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret felt lightheaded, barely able to believe what she was hearing. It was happening. It was really happening. Richard's face had gone from red to white. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "No, you can't. Margaret, tell them. Tell them we were happy. Tell them—" "We were never happy," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "You married me believing I was a penniless clerk's daughter. You treated me with cruelty and contempt. You stole from me, struck me, humiliated me publicly. And now that you've learned I have value, you want to pretend none of that happened." She straightened her shoulders, feeling strength flow through her like water finding its course. "But I remember everything, and I will testify to all of it." Richard lunged toward her, but the guard seized him, dragging him back. "You'll regret this," he shouted as they hauled him from the chamber. "You'll regret this, Margaret." But Margaret felt no regret, only a vast, expanding relief, as though chains she hadn't fully realized she'd been wearing had suddenly fallen away. The annulment proceedings took 3 weeks, during which Margaret lived in the Crown residence under her uncle's protection. She testified before church officials about the circumstances of her marriage, describing Richard's deception and subsequent cruelty in clinical detail that left her feeling hollow but also cleansed. Other witnesses corroborated her account. Neighbors from Boston, the apothecary Thomas Green, even Father Benedict, who traveled to London to speak on her behalf. Richard contested every point, but his defense crumbled under scrutiny. Evidence emerged of debts he'd hidden, of other women he'd courted under false pretenses, of a reputation for violence and dishonesty that made Margaret's testimony all too credible. In the end, even Richard's own friends refused to speak in his favor. The annulment was granted on November 28th, in a small church ceremony that officially dissolved the marriage. Margaret stood alone before the altar, speaking the words that severed her legal tie to Richard Ashford. And when it was done, she walked out into the cold London air, feeling as though she'd been reborn. Her uncle waited outside, and beside him stood Lord Blackwood. Both men bowed to her, not the courtesy shown to a married woman, but the respect due to a lady of independent means and title. "What will you do now?" her uncle asked, as they walked through the streets toward his London residence, where a celebration had been arranged. "You could stay in London, move into your own household, take your place at court. Or you could retire to Thornton Manor, manage your estates, live quietly in the country. The choice is entirely yours." Margaret considered the question, watching the city move around her, the merchants calling their wares, the nobles in their fine carriages, the common people hurrying about their business. A year ago, she would have chosen safety, would have hidden away in some quiet corner and hoped to be forgotten. But she wasn't that woman anymore. "I want to see my inheritance," she said finally. "Thornton Manor, the lands my father gave up to marry my mother. I want to understand what he sacrificed, what he chose love over." She smiled, feeling the expression sit naturally on her face for the first time in years. "And then I want to decide what to do with it, how to honor his memory and use what he's given me to help others who might be trapped as I was." Lord Blackwood smiled. "A worthy goal. And you'll have support in that endeavor, should you want it." The celebration that evening was intimate. Just Margaret, her uncle, Lord Blackwood, and a few trusted members of the Duke's household. They toasted her freedom, her inheritance, her future. Margaret drank wine that tasted of possibilities and felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep inside her, surprised that she still remembered how it felt. Later, standing on a balcony overlooking London's lights, her uncle joined her. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. William chose a hard path, giving up everything for love. But he chose wisely in the woman he loved, and he raised his daughter to be strong enough to claim what's rightfully hers. "I wish I'd known him better," Margaret said. "Known about his past, his sacrifices." "Perhaps it's better that you didn't," her uncle replied. "He wanted you to choose your own path, not feel bound by his legacy. And now you can. You're free, Margaret. Truly free. What you do with that freedom is up to you." Margaret thought about that as winter settled over London, as she made arrangements to travel to Thornton Manor in the spring, as she began to understand the full scope of her inheritance. She was 23 years old, unmarried, wealthy, and titled, a combination that made her an oddity in noble circles, but also, she was learning, gave her a unique kind of power. She could choose whom to associate with, whom to help, how to spend her resources. She could make decisions without asking permission, could move through the world as herself, rather than as someone's daughter or someone's wife. The freedom was dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating. Richard tried once more to approach her, catching her in the street near Westminster 3 weeks after the annulment. Margaret's guard stopped him before he got close, but his voice carried across the space between them. "I loved you," he shouted, and Margaret thought he might actually believe it, might have convinced himself that the cruelty had been love twisted into something dark. "I loved you, and you've destroyed me." Margaret looked at him, really looked, and saw not the monster who had haunted her nightmares, but simply a weak man who had confused ownership with affection, control with caring. She felt pity mix with her anger, and the combination was oddly freeing. "You destroyed yourself," she called back. "I just refuse to let you destroy me too." She turned and walked away, her guards forming a protective barrier, and she never saw Richard Ashford again. Spring came to England with unusual warmth, and Margaret traveled to Thornton Manor with her uncle, Lord Blackwood, and a small retinue of servants. The estate lay in the countryside northwest of London, a sprawling manor house surrounded by farms, forests, and several villages that owed it fealty. When Margaret first saw it rising above the greening landscape, she felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was what her father had given up. This beauty, this grandeur, this security. All of it sacrificed for love. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years, and wished she could have known what her parents' love had cost. But perhaps they'd thought the cost worth paying. Perhaps the years they'd had together, poor but free to choose each other, had been worth more than any estate. The manor's staff had prepared for Margaret's arrival, and they greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She was an unknown quantity, a woman arrived from poverty to claim her birthright, bringing with her the taint of scandal from her annulled marriage. But she was also their lady now, the person whose decisions would shape their livelihoods and futures. Margaret spent the first weeks learning the estate's workings, meeting with the steward, touring the farms, speaking with the villagers. She listened more than she talked, learning about their concerns, their needs, the ways the estate had been mismanaged in the years since her father's departure. Slowly, she began to implement changes, reducing certain rents, improving working conditions, establishing a fund to help widows and orphans. Her uncle watched these efforts with approval. "You're a natural administrator," he told her one evening over dinner in the manor's great hall. "Your father would be proud." "I just want to help," Margaret said. "I remember what it was like to be powerless, to depend on others' mercy. If I can use what I have to ease that for even a few people." Lord Blackwood, who had stayed on as an unofficial advisor, smiled. "You're building something here, Lady Margaret. Not just managing an estate, but creating a model for how land and power can be used responsibly. People notice. And they did notice. Word spread of the young noblewoman who had clawed her way from poverty to wealth and now used her position to help others. Margaret received letters from women in similar circumstances, seeking advice or assistance. She responded to as many as she could, sometimes offering financial help, sometimes just guidance, sometimes simply the assurance that they weren't alone in their struggles. The months turned into a year, and Margaret's life settled into a rhythm that felt right, working with her steward in the mornings, riding through the estates in the afternoons, spending evenings reviewing accounts or correspondence. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a girl, but it was hers, chosen and claimed through her own determination. One afternoon in late summer, as she walked through the manor's gardens, her uncle found her. His expression was serious, and Margaret's heart sank, fearing bad news. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quickly. "But there's something I need to tell you, something I've debated revealing for months now." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Your father's papers, the records he kept, they contained more than just lists of Lancaster supporters. There were also personal letters, including several from your mother." Margaret's breath caught. "Letters from my mother?" Her uncle nodded. "Your father saved every letter she wrote him during their courtship. I've had them transcribed and bound. I thought you might want to read them, to understand what brought your parents together." The book he handed her was leather-bound, its pages filled with her mother's words copied in a careful hand. Margaret clutched it to her chest, feeling tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, she read the letters by candlelight, and through them she came to know her mother not as a dim childhood memory but as a vibrant, intelligent woman who had chosen love over security just as her father had. The letters revealed a courtship built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection, everything Margaret's own marriage had lacked. One passage struck her particularly hard. "I know what you're giving up for me, William, and I cannot ask you to make such a sacrifice. But you say you would be giving up nothing of value compared to what we would build together. You say that love and freedom matter more than titles and gold. I pray you're right. I pray we can build something beautiful from our choice." They had built something beautiful, Margaret realized. A life lived on their own terms. A daughter raised with love even in poverty. A legacy of courage that had ultimately saved that daughter when she most needed saving. Her parents had shown her that freedom was worth any cost, and she had proven herself their daughter by claiming it. The years that followed brought Margaret into full command of her position and responsibilities. She never remarried, though offers came, some genuine, others clearly motivated by her wealth. She found she preferred her independence, the ability to make decisions without compromise or consultation. Her estates flourished, her tenants prospered, and her reputation as a fair and innovative administrator spread throughout the region. She maintained her friendship with Lord Blackwood, who became one of her most trusted advisors. The Duke, her uncle, grew frail with age, but remained proud of his niece's accomplishments. And Margaret herself grew into the role she'd never expected to fill. Not just a lady of property, but a symbol of what was possible when courage met opportunity. On the 5th anniversary of her arrival at Thornton Manor, Margaret stood in the same garden where her uncle had given her the letters, looking out over the estates that had become her home. She was 28 years old, wealthy beyond measure, respected, and more importantly, free. The scared girl who had stood in a Boston apothecary counting her last pennies seemed like someone from another lifetime. But she hadn't forgotten her. She never would. Because that girl's suffering had taught Margaret something precious. The value of freedom, the importance of helping others, the strength that comes from surviving and then choosing to thrive. She thought of Richard sometimes, though she'd heard he'd left England for the continent, unable to bear the shame of his public humiliation. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that he could no longer hurt her or anyone else she cared about. She thought of her father more often, wishing she could tell him that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that his daughter had honored his memory by using her inheritance to help others as he had done. But mostly, she thought about the future, about the estate she would continue to build, the people she would help, the legacy she would leave. She had been given a second chance at life, rescued from poverty and abuse by an inheritance she'd never expected. Now it was her turn to be someone else's unexpected rescue, someone else's second chance. A servant approached with a message, another letter from a woman in distress, seeking advice. Margaret smiled and took it, already planning her response. There was always more work to be done, more people to help, more good to accomplish with the resources she'd been given. She walked back toward the manor, its stone walls solid and welcoming in the afternoon sun, and felt grateful, not just for the wealth and security, but for the journey that had brought her here. The suffering had been real, but so was the triumph, and she had earned every moment of peace she now enjoyed. Inside the manor, she sat at her desk and began to write, her words flowing easily now, offering guidance to someone who needed it just as she once had. Outside, the sun moved across the sky, marking the passage of time in a life that had become everything she'd never dared to dream it could be. Freedom, choice, purpose. These were her inheritance now, worth more than any treasury or title, and she would spend the rest of her life proving that her father's sacrifice, and her own long struggle, had been worth it. The morning of Margaret's 29th birthday arrived with unexpected frost coating the windows of Thornton Manor, transforming the landscape into something crystalline and otherworldly. She stood in her private chambers, watching the sun break through the clouds and set the frozen world sparkling, when a commotion from the courtyard below drew her attention. 3 riders approached at speed, their horses' breath forming clouds in the cold air. Even from this distance, Margaret recognized the royal livery, and her heart quickened. Messages from court were not uncommon. Her position and wealth made her someone the crown consulted on various matters. But riders arriving at such an hour suggested urgency. She descended to the great hall, just as the lead messenger was being shown in by her steward, Thomas Hartwell. The young man bowed deeply, his face flushed from the cold ride. "Lady Margaret, forgive the early intrusion. I bring urgent summons from His Majesty King Henry VII himself. You are requested to attend court within the fortnight." He produced a sealed letter, the royal crest pressed deep into red wax. Margaret took the letter with steady hands, though her mind raced. "Does the message indicate the nature of this summons?" "The king wishes to consult you on matters of estate management and women's legal protections, my lady. There have been developments at court that require your particular expertise." After the messenger departed to rest and refresh himself, Margaret broke the seal and read the king's formal request. The language was courteous but clear. Her reputation had reached the highest levels of power, and Henry VII wanted her counsel on proposed reforms to laws governing women's property rights. Several noblewomen had petitioned the crown for protections, similar to those Margaret had secured, and the king sought her input on whether such protections could be implemented more broadly. Her uncle arrived later that morning, having received his own summons. They sat together in the library, the fire crackling as they discussed the implications. "This is significant, Margaret," the Duke said, his aged hands wrapped around a cup of mulled wine. If the king is truly considering legal reforms, your voice could shape the lives of countless women. But you must understand, there will be opposition. Many lords will see this as an attack on their rights, their control over their wives' inheritances. Let them oppose it, Margaret said quietly. I've faced worse than angry noblemen. If I can help even one woman avoid what I endured, it will be worth whatever political battles come. The journey to London took 4 days through winter roads, Margaret traveling with a small retinue that included her uncle, her steward, and a dozen guards. Lord Blackwood met them at the city gates, his expression serious but warm. "You've caused quite a stir, Lady Margaret," he said as he rode alongside her carriage. Half the court is eager to meet the woman who escaped an abusive marriage and turned her inheritance into a model estate. The other half thinks you're a dangerous radical who threatens the natural order. Which half does the king belong to? Margaret asked wryly. Henry is pragmatic above all else. He sees political advantage in being viewed as a reformer, as someone who protects the vulnerable. But he also needs the support of traditional nobles. Your role will be to convince him that reform can be both morally right and politically beneficial. Margaret was housed in a fine residence near Westminster, and for 2 days, she met with various court officials, legal scholars, and even a few noblewomen who had experienced situations similar to her own. Their stories were heartbreaking and familiar. Marriages made under false pretenses. Husbands who proved cruel once the vows were spoken. Women trapped by law and custom with no recourse. One woman, Lady Catherine Pembroke, described how her husband had sold off her family's lands piece by piece to fund his gambling, leaving her children with nothing. Another, a merchant's widow named Elizabeth Crane, told how her late husband's brother had tried to claim her business, arguing that a woman couldn't properly manage commercial affairs. In each case, the women had fought back with varying degrees of success, but all acknowledged that Margaret's high-profile annulment and the crown's protection of her inheritance had given them hope. "You showed us it was possible," Lady Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "You proved that the law could be bent, that power could be wielded on behalf of the powerless. We need you to help make that possibility available to all of us." The audience with King Henry VII took place in a private chamber, not the grand throne room. Margaret had expected formality and distance, but the king proved surprisingly direct. He was in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that assessed her carefully as she curtsied. "Lady Margaret Thornton," he said, gesturing for her to rise. "Your reputation precedes you. Lord Blackwood speaks highly of your intelligence and your administrative abilities. I'm told your estates are among the best managed in the kingdom." "You honor me, Your Majesty. I've simply tried to apply common sense and compassion to estate management." "Common sense and compassion are rarer qualities than you might think, especially among the nobility." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've called you here because I'm considering reforms to laws governing women's property and marriage rights. But I need to understand the practical implications. If we give women more legal protections, what happens to social stability? To family structures? To the natural order that has governed England for centuries?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "Your Majesty, I would argue that protecting women's rights strengthens rather than weakens families and social stability. A woman who is secure in her person and property is more likely to manage her household well, to raise healthy children, to contribute positively to her community. A woman who lives in fear of losing everything to a cruel husband's whims is likely to be desperate, unhappy, and unable to fulfill any positive role." "But some would say that a husband's authority over his wife is divinely ordained," one of the king's advisors interjected. "That weakening that authority invites chaos. I would say that divine authority includes the commandment to love and cherish, not to abuse and exploit," Margaret replied evenly. "My own marriage was sanctioned by the church and the law, but it was a prison that benefited no one. Not me, not my husband, not the community we lived in. The annulment freed me to become productive, to use my inheritance for good. Surely that serves God's purposes better than my continued suffering would have. Henry nodded slowly. You make a compelling argument. But the practical question remains. How do we implement such protections without alienating the nobility whose support I need? For the next hour, Margaret outlined a system that would balance traditional male authority with protections for women's inherited property and basic rights. She proposed that estates inherited by women before marriage could be held in trust, managed jointly by husband and wife, but not solely controlled by the husband. She suggested legal mechanisms for women to petition for separation in cases of extreme cruelty, with their property protected during such proceedings. She even proposed education reforms that would teach women basic law and finance, making them better equipped to manage their own affairs. The king listened intently, occasionally asking probing questions, testing the logic of her proposals. Finally, he stood, and everyone in the room rose with him. Lady Margaret, you've given me much to consider. I cannot promise immediate reforms. These things take time, and political capital must be spent wisely. But I can promise that your ideas will be seriously discussed and debated, and I can offer you something more immediate. He paused, his expression becoming formal. I hereby appoint you as Royal Advisor on Women's Affairs, a new position within my court. You will have the authority to review petitions from women seeking crown protection, to recommend legal interventions in cases of abuse or property theft, and to counsel me on matters affecting women throughout the kingdom. Margaret felt the weight of the title settle onto her shoulders. It was more than she had hoped for, and with it came both power and responsibility. Your Majesty, I am honored, and I accept. I will serve to the best of my ability. The news of her appointment spread through court like wildfire. That evening, Margaret's residence was besieged with visitors, some congratulating her, others seeking her immediate help with their own situations, still others clearly testing her, trying to determine if she was a genuine reformer or simply an opportunist who had gotten lucky. Lord Blackwood found her late that night, sitting alone in the library, staring at the formal document that outlined her new duties. Overwhelming? He asked gently. Terrifying, Margaret admitted. What if I fail? What if I make mistakes that hurt the very people I'm trying to help? Then you'll learn from those mistakes and do better, he said simply. Margaret, you're not expected to be perfect. You're expected to try, to use your position and your experience to make things even slightly better than they were. That's all any of us can do. Over the following weeks, Margaret established herself in her new role. She set up a system for reviewing petitions, working with legal scholars to identify cases where Crown intervention might be justified. She met with women from all social classes, listening to their stories, learning about the different forms their struggles took. A noblewoman facing an arranged marriage to a known abuser, a merchant's daughter whose inheritance was being contested by male relatives, a peasant woman whose husband beat her but whom the local authorities refused to help because a man's discipline of his wife is his own business. Not all cases could be helped. Some were too legally complex, others politically dangerous to intervene in. But Margaret did what she could, and slowly, patterns emerged. She began to see how laws could be changed, how precedents could be set, how the machinery of royal power could be leveraged on behalf of those who had no power of their own. Her work brought her into contact with other reformers at court, people who shared her vision of a more just society. There was Father Michael, a church scholar who argued that true Christian values demanded protection for the vulnerable. There was Sir Robert Manning, a judge who had grown disgusted with the legal system's bias against women. And there was Lady Elizabeth Hastings, a widow who had successfully fought off attempts to steal her late husband's merchant empire and now used her wealth to help other women in similar situations. Together, they formed an informal alliance, coordinating their efforts, sharing information, supporting each other's initiatives. They became known at court as Lady Margaret's Circle, though they preferred to think of themselves simply as people who believed in justice. but success bred opposition. A faction of traditionalist nobles, led by Lord Henry Blackstone, began actively working against Margaret's reforms. They spread rumors about her, that she was secretly controlling the king, that she sought to undermine all masculine authority, that her real goal was to destroy the family structure entirely. Some of the rumors were merely absurd, but others were more insidious, designed to undermine her credibility and frighten people away from supporting her work. The confrontation came at a court gathering 6 months after Margaret's appointment. Lord Blackstone approached her publicly, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Lady Margaret, I wonder if you might explain to us all how a woman who couldn't manage her own marriage presumes to advise the king on matters of law and governance." The room fell silent. Margaret felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of the moment. This was a test, she realized, not just of her composure, but of whether she would fight back or retreat in the face of public attack. She met Lord Blackstone's gaze steadily. "My marriage failed, Lord Blackstone, because I chose a man who presented himself falsely, and then revealed his true character only after it was too late to escape. I learned from that experience that our current laws trap women in dangerous situations and protect men who abuse that power. If my suffering can be turned into wisdom that helps others, then perhaps it wasn't entirely in vain. But surely you can see how unseemly it is for a woman, particularly one with your history, to be advising the king on matters of such importance." "I can see how uncomfortable it makes men like you," Margaret replied calmly. "Men who benefit from laws that give them unchecked power over women's lives and property. But His Majesty saw fit to value my experience and insight. If you question his judgment, perhaps you should take that up with him directly." It was a calculated risk, invoking the king's authority, but it worked. Lord Blackstone's face reddened, but he couldn't directly challenge the king without appearing disloyal. He retreated with a stiff bow, but Margaret knew she had made a powerful enemy. Lord Blackwood found her later, concern evident in his expression. "Blackstone won't forget that humiliation. He'll work against you now even more actively." "Let him," Margaret said, though her hands trembled slightly from the aftermath of confrontation. "I didn't come to court to make friends among men who benefit from unjust laws. I came to change those laws, and I'll do whatever that requires." The political battle intensified over the following months. Margaret's circle pushed for reforms, while Blackstone's faction fought them at every turn. The king watched the struggle with apparent interest, occasionally intervening to tip the balance but mostly allowing the two sides to clash. Margaret came to understand that Henry was using the conflict to his advantage. By allowing debate and opposition, he could claim to be responding to popular will rather than imposing his own agenda. It was exhausting work, navigating court politics while still trying to help individual women who sought her aid. Margaret often worked late into the night, reviewing cases, drafting legal arguments, meeting with allies to coordinate strategy. She rarely returned to Thornton Manor, maintaining it through correspondence with her steward, but keeping herself anchored in London where the real battles were fought. A breakthrough came unexpectedly in the form of a scandal. Lord Blackstone's own daughter, Lady Anne, appeared at Margaret's residence late one night, bruised and desperate. Her father had arranged her marriage to an elderly lord whose cruelty was well known, and the wedding was scheduled for the following week. "Please," Lady Anne begged, kneeling before Margaret. "I've heard what you've done for others. I know my father opposes everything you stand for, but I'm his daughter, and I'm terrified. Help me." It was a delicate situation. Helping Lady Anne would enrage Lord Blackstone and could be seen as a political attack. But refusing to help would undermine everything Margaret claimed to stand for, that all women deserved protection, regardless of who their fathers were. Margaret made her choice quickly. "Get up, Lady Anne. You don't kneel to ask for help. You're a human being with rights, regardless of what your father or anyone else says." She sent for Lord Blackwood and Father Michael, and together they crafted a petition to the king, requesting a stay on the marriage while Lady Anne's situation was investigated. The king granted the stay, and the investigation revealed that the elderly lord in question had a history of violence against women that had been quietly covered up by those who benefited from his wealth and connections. The revelation caused a scandal that swept through court, vindicating Margaret's intervention and badly damaging Lord Blackstone's reputation. In the aftermath, even some of Blackstone's former allies began to support Margaret's reforms. The tide was turning, slowly but unmistakably. The king, seeing the political advantage, announced his intention to introduce legislation protecting women's inherited property and establishing formal mechanisms for women to seek crown intervention in cases of abuse. It wasn't everything Margaret had hoped for. The reforms were more limited than she'd proposed, and they would take years to fully implement. But they were real, tangible changes that would help actual women. It was a beginning. Lady Anne became one of Margaret's closest allies, using her position and her father's shame to advocate for other young women facing forced marriages. Lord Blackstone himself withdrew from court, his influence broken, his daughter's rebellion the final humiliation he couldn't overcome. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret found herself reflecting on how far she had come. 5 years ago, she'd been a terrified woman trapped in an abusive marriage, counting pennies in a Boston apothecary. Now she sat in the King's Council, shaping laws that would affect generations of women throughout England. But the work was far from over. Each day brought new petitions, new stories of suffering, new battles to fight. Margaret threw herself into it all with determination, born of her own painful experience. She knew what it meant to be powerless, and that knowledge drove her to use her power on behalf of others. One evening, as she sat in her London residence reviewing documents, a messenger arrived with news from Thornton Manor. Her steward reported that 3 young women had arrived seeking refuge. Sisters who had fled their father's estate after he'd tried to force them into marriages with his creditors to settle his gambling debts. They had heard of Lady Margaret's work and traveled for days to seek her protection. Margaret immediately penned a response, authorizing her steward to provide the women with shelter, food, and legal assistance. She would review their case personally when she could return to Thornton Manor. But for now, she sent word that they were safe, that someone was fighting for them, that they were not alone. As she sealed the letter, Margaret thought about the girl she had been, frightened, alone, believing there was no escape from her suffering. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what lay ahead, assure her that the pain would end, and that she would not only survive but thrive. But perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps the suffering had been necessary to forge the woman she'd become, to give her the strength and understanding needed for the work she now did. Perhaps every moment of pain had served a purpose, had been building toward this. She didn't know if she believed that entirely. Some suffering was simply cruel and meaningless, served no higher purpose at all. But she could choose to make her suffering meaningful by using it to help others. And that choice, that decision to transform pain into purpose, was perhaps the truest freedom of all. The candles burned low as Margaret continued her work, and outside her window, London settled into sleep. But she remained awake, fighting battles with parchment and ink, wielding power that had once seemed impossible, building a legacy that would outlast her. She had been saved by an unexpected inheritance, rescued by documents her father had hidden away and an uncle she'd never known. Now she was becoming someone else's rescue, someone else's unexpected hope. And there was no greater purpose she could imagine than that.